like most good, hopefully good, facial recognition talks, this one starts with naval warfare. Now, this is how naval battles used to be fought. Two fleets across from each other in two lines, attacking each other at near point blank range until one gives up or sinks. In 1805, Lord Admiral Nelson changed this with a new naval warfare tactic. Basically, it just consisted of going straight at the enemy, as you can see here. What do you think happens when you take one huge fleet of ships and fling them directly at another huge fleet of ships? Yeah, that's right. A hot mess, right? Friend and foe mixed together, close range, fog of war, really hard to identify who is who, identify friend and foe. And Nelson knew this, and so legend has it that he painted all of his ships in this particular color scheme, now known as a Nelson checker. And this, as an authentication scheme, was nearly perfect, at least in the first battle. Why? Because it was accurate. Only his ships were painted in this scheme. And it was easy to use, right? At a single glance, every ship, every gun crew, every individual sailor could look up and say friend or foe and take immediate action. As you might imagine, it led him to actually hoist his message to his fleet. And instead of giving directions, you ship, go there, go here, as you normally would, he just lifted a message to his entire fleet and said, look, do your job. Like, take responsibility. I've enabled you. Take action. After that first battle, however, which was a success, even though he died, we'll gloss over that part, this scheme faltered a bit. Why? For the same reasons. It suffered problems with accuracy and ease of use. Accuracy, because people aren't stupid, right? They immediately, the other fleet, started paying themselves to mimic Nelson's fleet. And then secondarily, ease of use. It doesn't take a genius, but about 10 minutes to realize, oh, look, all the enemy ships are painted a particular way, and they could use the same scheme as well. Facial recognition has the same give and take. When it works well, and by that I mean more of a one-to-one scenario. Classic example, think of facial recognition on your mobile device where it's comparing it to your image that you voluntarily recorded in a secure enclave. It's pretty great, right? It's accurate and it's easy to use. It identifies you and gives you some strong auth. And you're going to look at your phone anyway. You're not going out of your way to do anything. But just like Nelson's scheme, it ran into problems as soon as the ball game changed a bit. When it went from 1 to 1 to 1 to n. Now, instead of comparing single photos, there would be a still from a video or from a surveillance camera or some such, and it'd be compared to a database. And that would return a top n number of suspects or possible candidates, if you will. And just like Nelson, it ran into issues as soon as it started using this scheme. Issues with accuracy and ease of use. First, accuracy. In 2018, Dr. Joy Buolamwini at MIT realized that facial recognition systems could not identify her own face because she was a dark-skinned female. That led to lots of research by her Algorithmic Justice League and documentation of false arrest. 3 or 4 men in Detroit were falsely arrested based off of video facial recognition systems. Because what was happening was these systems were being sold to law enforcement, to agencies to kind of identify suspects, leading to potential false arrests. The work of the Algorithmic Justice League and adversarial research like Dr. Buolamwini's improved the bias scores and the bias issues with some of these major enterprises, and some enterprises like IBM decided to leave the technology altogether. But it wasn't just bias and accuracy, it was also ease of use that presented a challenge. And that's because think of all the photos of you or people you love out on social media. Pretty soon, companies like Clearview AI and PimEyes started farming all of these photographs, building a massive database, and then in turn, selling it to law enforcement agencies or neighborhood associations or on PIMIs, you could go out and search for yourself for people you know right now and see where they've been on the internet and in the real world. The database was 20 billion for Clearview, and this is like 2 or 3 years old. It's much larger now. So the issue is that it was too easy to use in a way, right? Photos that were uploaded for personal or private use were now being weaponized against the very people that uploaded them. So accuracy and ease of use. And we saw examples of enterprises realizing the danger and trying to address bias and taking care of some of their facial data and biometric data. And we've seen the government try and step in Illinois with BIPOC and GDPR, and the Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe, which is trying to limit sharing of facial data between nation states in Europe. But we can't rely just on enterprises and the government to protect or help people protect their privacy, right? We need to enable individuals to play an active role because privacy is a team sport. Adversarial research has been moving from bias, addressing bias like I talked about before, into trying to deal with that ease of use, that universal access of photographic data online. Basically saying, how can we give people tools to protect themselves that kind of can be used in normal flow? I'm going to go cover 5 or 6 different approaches that have emerged since 2001, most of them in the last year. And we're going to start with one that I ran into in 2019. I wrote a Spartacus app that tried to protect privacy of your social media accounts at DEF CON Black Hat 2019. And as part of that, I needed a fake identity. So I made one, wholesale. And I needed a photo for my fake identity to give her authenticity online. This is the photo I chose. After I did this, a couple days later, my friend called me up and said, Mike, you can't use this woman. I was like, why not? She was open stock photography. She's domain, public domain. He said, have you done a reverse image search on her? And I said, no. How many sites is she on? 10,000? 4,000? No. 25 billion hits. Right? She was everywhere. She was a mystery novel writer in Des Moines. She was a lawmaker in DC. She was a diplomat in Amsterdam. She was a sex worker in Vegas. She was everywhere and she was nowhere at the same time. So one potential approach, if you chose to take it to protect your facial data, would be to put yourself in every stock photography you can find. I'm not saying it's recommended, but again, like her, you would be everywhere and nowhere. Onward to academia, though, more realistic approaches. 2001, researchers started to experiment with pixel modification, basically finding the gradient in changes in images and facial data, inserting geometric patterns or even single pixels in key areas, throwing off facial recognition systems. Facial recognition systems caught on very quickly as the cat and mouse game goes on, but it was an interesting start. And what I'll do is we go through these, and these slides will be available later. I'm kind of categorizing these in 5 areas. For example, this pixel modification. Is it fast? Sure is. Inserting a pixel is pretty darn quick. Is it on mobile? It was not at the time in 2001. Is it dynamic, meaning is it per image? That checks that box as well. Is it transparent? In other words, have I modified this photo so much that I wouldn't want to share it with family and friends and my own mother? No, it's pretty transparent. And then protective. There are 2 phases for facial recognition, face detection and face matching or classification. And so this one basically messes up the ability of the system to detect faces. So far, so good. We'll build up this graph. Next up is generative adversarial networks. Most people have seen this in the thispersondoesnotexist.com website. That's the technology it's using behind the scenes. It keeps your high-level attributes, modifies things so it doesn't quite look like you. And the issue here is that it's basically your avatar. It's not you, but a lot of people would use it one place everywhere, and it's fairly expensive. It has come to mobile. Everyone who's used Tunify or anything else, the recent app, I can't remember the name of it at this point, Face app, there were others that made your own little avatar that everybody used. Same kind of thing here. Is it fast? It can be, but in the past it's not been when it's done to photorealism standards. It's not dynamic because it's just this one image avatar of you. Transparent, certainly not, because again, it's not you really at all. And then really, it's still identifiable as a face. It's just not recognizable as you if you put it out there. 2020, now we're going to start to get interesting. There's a paper and a demonstration Android app that's a little wonky, but you can still get it to run on today's devices, called Camera Adversarial. What this does is it takes your default image and then places procedural noise on top of it. Fancy word for random noise over top of the image, lightening and darkening, pixel by pixel. Same kind of technique as used to create landscapes for video games. It's adjustable. You can see that originally the system identified it as a screwdriver. Once the noise was created and injected, it identified it as a quill, which isn't that impressive until you see it in real life. Obviously, far left, this is not my face, this is me. It's identifying that it's a suit, right? Not a face, but we'll just use that as a placeholder. And then as I increase, because you can increase the protection, I've been identified as wearing chainmail, possibly corn, and my personal favorite, I like to think it's that I'm wearing a turtle, but maybe it thought I was a turtle. Either way, as you can see, it becomes less usable over time, right? Still fascinating, and it's kind of nice because it's super fast. You're just laying noise over top. It's already in a mobile format, so easily corruptible. Open source, by the way. Is it dynamic? Yeah, you can do it picture by picture. You can generate new noise for every photo. Is it transparent? Sort of. I put yes. If you don't dial it way up and make me look like a turtle, then you're probably in business. And again, it's that detection. Is there a face? Is there not a face? Not so much the matchy-matchy face-to-face technique. Now we're into the more sophisticated stuff. I call this cloaked poisoning because it's easier to understand if I use that phrasing. There were two academic papers and pieces that came out near about the same time in 2020, Fawkes and Lowkey out of different academic institutions. The idea here is you would take your original photo, take a stock of photos, and pick the one that doesn't look like you mathematically, and then it would kind of combine the feature set so that your original photo was modified slightly, but hopefully not enough that enough to thwart facial recognition, but not enough that it didn't look like you. And then it would be put out into the wild. The idea being these commercial systems would pick it up, enter their database, and be poisoned by their training data. And as a result, when the original, say a video, whatever else, came back out, it would do recognition on you, and it would still identify your face, but it would misidentify who you were. Sounds kind of starting to be a little more ideal what we're looking for. A couple things. This is the more, the graphic from the academic paper. They used a loss function called structural dissimilarity index. Basically, it's trying to minimize minimize the amount it can recognize you with a commercial system, but make it maximally usable, things you would show other people. It was a Mac and Windows application. It was open source. They have it for M1 Mac Silicon at this point. It's pretty great, but to run it on a couple images took on the order of 2 to 5 minutes. So if our goal is to give people the same experience as Face ID, how do you take pictures? Do you take a picture and then wait 5 minutes before you upload it? Certainly not, right? Lowkey, very similar, different loss function. This one's learn perceptual image patch similarity, which is why you see why they abbreviate it to LIPS, because that's just fun. It comprehends the entire pipeline, which is slightly different than Fawkes. Fawkes was doing mainly just classification. This one, the way the math works out, it takes into both of those, detection and classification. The thing about this one, it's a hosted web service. It's not open source. You submit your pictures to a web service, and then they email you back the results. So there's something there. What does it look like? Again, using this person as a sample. Far left, you can see that my original photo is there in the same park, same outfit, conveniently. As we dial up the protection, I start to see some artifacts, but by the time you get to the high protection over here, it kind of starts to look like someone has beaten me about the head and shoulders with a lead pipe, right? If I put this out on social media, I'm going to get a phone call from my mother within about 7 minutes asking me if I'm okay. So there's a balance to be had here. Effectiveness, which we haven't done as much of or talked about, but it's also important, right? Because one of the things you want to know is, if I'm applying these protections, how much am I really protected, at least in the moment, right? So you can see the Fawkes protection scheme right there, as reported by authors themselves. They test against the commercially available systems. You note that they did really well against Azure until they didn't. In January of 2021, Azure did something, they're not really sure what, that improved how Azure performed against their protection system. So they went back and rewrote some algorithms and got a lot of that protection back. Lowkey, I like their reporting better because they're reporting against the top end results. Remember I said the name of the game is to not be in that top 5, top 10, top 50 results. That's what's going on here. Now, you also note that Lowkey is throwing a little bit of shade on Fawkes here, saying that, well, they did an okay job, but Lowkey does a lot better. If you're thinking about these approaches, they're not fast. It's really hard to tell how long Lowkey takes, but the email doesn't come back, in a 30 seconds time frame. They're not on mobile. They are dynamic. They're picture by picture. They're transparent for the most part, as long as you don't turn the protection up to high. And depending on which one, they're protective with both or with just classification. Both of these had a lot of publicity. New York Times, Wired, all that kind of stuff back in 2020. There's one last research paper of note, and this was called One Person, One Mask. It's come out in this last year or so. This is actually pretty fascinating. It's kind of using that procedural noise concept, except running some training on it so that it's customized for your face. And so it's a procedural noise that shifts the feature set away from you specifically. And then you would just apply that mask to any photo after that, and without any training or poisoning or anything else of these commercial systems, the idea is that it would misidentify you. This is more of a class-wise protection, and you can see them call that out. In other words, instead of image-by-image protection, this is just a set of noise you would put over any picture that you put out there. Advantages and disadvantages, right? As always, if you're being pursued by a nation state, I wouldn't trust any of this, right? Your mileage may vary. If you're a normal person-ish, you're going to get somewhere between 33 to 66%, depending on the day and the picture and these types of things. The cool part about this approach is it starts to use PyTorch, which means you can actually do it quickly enough and apply this procedural noise mask quickly enough to inject in front of your face in video on a frame-by-frame in a near real-time approach, because that's going to be the next step. Going back to our chart, yes, it's fast. No, it's not on mobile. I'm working on that part. It's dynamic in a way. It's class-wise, not image-by-image. It is transparent. It's not really even half as intrusive as what we saw with Fawkes and Lowkey. It's also not quite as protective as we saw in the stats, but it does try to disturb the pathways, the detection, and the classification. You'll note, there's one more column, and you'll note that most of these don't have mobile options. In 2019, I started playing with this stuff, and in 2020, Fawkes and Lowkey came about, and so I tried to incorporate those into a mobile app kind of proof of concept, just to see what was possible. Limited by a couple things. There is no training for TensorFlow Lite or PyTorch equivalent machine learning systems. There's no training on device, or at least there wasn't at that point. With TensorFlow, you can now do it on device, which means any training, any protection generation, those types of things would have to be done off the device. So I did kind of what I could with the technology we had, which was two things. One was fast style transfer, which you see here at the top. Basically, you take an image and then you take a style you want to modify your image into, and then you decide how much influence you want for the original content versus the style to have. Again, if you look at some of these examples, they get kind of horrific as well and unusable. The other one that was more interesting was the procedural noise. generating that and placing it over top. And so this is what the general flow of that open source app that's out on GitHub still basically applies a style change to your image, puts procedural noise over top of that, and then checks to see if it can detect a face or not. I didn't have time to put in classification comparison against a known face on the mobile device itself, but after it does that check to say, do I see a face or not, it goes back and allows you to modify your approach, more or less protection, and then saves to a dedicated album so they can upload it later on. The whole idea here is to give people agency and to make it in as much of the normal process that they go through as possible. There's a demo. I can show you some screenshots. I'll blow through this demo. It's a narrated demo, and nobody has time for that. So, like I said, I'm not a designer. I don't know if you noticed that. But basically, either from the camera roll or in this case, from an image you take, oh, look, it was the same day. It takes the picture. Then after you choose to use it, it shrinks it down into a slightly smaller format. Most of these approaches need a 384 by 384 image before it can scale it back up. Yeah, and this is why you don't do this part. Okay, and then you choose the style, classic art examples here. Once you apply it, well, actually, before you apply it, you can do a detect face on the mobile app. You can see whether or not it identifies a face and some of the features. And then after you apply, obviously, if you jack it way up, it's not going to find a face at all, but you can manipulate it until it's an appropriate level of protection, and then you can save it off to a dedicated photo album that on the device. And so that's the general idea. So ideally, all yeses in this last tab column. I'm kind of hesitant to say that. I think once one person, one mask gets in, I think it'll be a lot more viable. You should be asking yourself this at this point, right? Is this practical? Would anybody really use this? I'd say, yeah, no and yes, yes and no. Like, in other words, I've got lots of friends, if you ever ask them, do you want something like this? They say, you bet I do, right? But they're not going to go out of their way to take extra steps. And as well, the technology only is just arriving on mobile to do things like Fawkes and Lowkey and one person, one mask. So I think it's coming, but I think it's more to raise awareness and to grant people agency. And that's what this is all about, right? Protecting privacy, especially of biometric information, is a team sport. Enterprises, governments, and individuals have a role to play. And it's when we all play that together that we can be like Nelson, to throw back from the beginning. We can raise our flag and say, look, everyone has a responsibility in this process. Thank you. Questions, concerns, complaints?
The photos that we've seen so far from your slides, they look very artifacty, even with the lowest settings. And I know normal people don't want to appear like that on social media. They want to look good to their friends and family. And so it makes the usability of a platform like this questionable for the general public. My concern is, do you think it will ever become usable for the general public who do want to preserve their looks while also having some privacy and agency?
I think as a technology, I think it'll be a cat and mouse kind of thing. In other words, I think that what I've seen is they get better, the algorithms get better, and as a technology, especially on device, gets better, I think that one person, one mask, those types of techniques where it's protecting you as a class will be better. I think it's too costly to be more refined in terms of, I agree with you. If you look really closely, you can see artifacts, right? It depends on what the use case is, right? Especially, I think these days with the trending to video, that's going to be especially key. And we're not quite there yet.
Hi there, thank you for the talk. Are there any retroactive steps you can take if your facial data has already been scraped?
Everyone in this room is in trouble. No, not particularly. right? What you're trying to do is you could poison the cache of the data it has on you, but it depends on how much is already out there, right? You are already, most likely you are already in a Clearview database and you're already in a PIMIze, I know I am, PIMIze database. So that's an ongoing challenge, right? Now, there's also the side effect that if I take a picture or a video and I put it up on someplace online, you saw the local park behind me. If you were good enough at open source intelligence, you would know where I live, even if you didn't know me, right? So there are side applications besides just not being identifiable to law enforcement. If you're being stalked or being pursued or otherwise harassed, there may be side benefits as well to privacy in the moment or as you upload new content. It's a great question, though.
You don't have any more time for
Okay,
questions.
yeah. Well, I'll be around. So thanks, y'all. Have a good day.